This is a production of Cornell University.
Glad you all could make it to this special event sponsored by the Leo Nevis Human Rights Fund. We are delighted to be able to welcome back to Cornell Law School one of our own. Saman Zia-Zarifi, as you probably know, is a graduate of Cornell Law School in '93. He's also a graduate of Cornell University in 1990. When he graduated from law school, I believe he spent several years as a litigation attorney in Los Angeles, if I recall correctly, before realizing that the academy was a much nicer place. He went back to school where he got his LLM at NYU in 1997. He then went to Erasmus University in Amsterdam, where he spent several years teaching and doing research, after which he joined Human Rights Watch in the year 2000. He has been with Human Rights Watch from that time until this week, I think. He is still officially a human rights official, but he's also, as of last week, officially an Amnesty International official. Sam has moved from Human Rights Watch to Amnesty International, where he is now the director of their Asia division. I'm tempted to tell you something about the depth and richness of Sam's experience, but I'm afraid if I got started, I would eat up much of the precious time we have available. So although there's so much that could be said about this amazing man, I'm just going to turn the floor over to Sam now.
Wait until I'm done before you...
One administrative note, if you're here and need a Law and Society event credit, the sign-up sheet is down here and you can sign it when this is over.
Thank you. It is delightful to be back. This is actually my second event with the law school, and it's been a long time. I guess I was last here in 2003. So it's lovely to be back. I admit I was not completely clear about what this was going to look like today. So I will be slightly shambolic and disorganized, but I think ultimately productive. And let me tell you just briefly what I'm going to do. I'm going to start with something that I had normally promised everyone that I wouldn't do, but that's with a PowerPoint presentation, because I realize that it's probably true that most of you don't know what I do as a lawyer. And I thought it would be helpful to actually give you a sense of what I do as a lawyer, and meanwhile shamelessly plug the work of organizations like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, to whom you should give often and plenty. Then I want to actually move into what is a slightly more substantive bit of discussion, where we really need your help, not financially, but intellectually, about problems of international law and areas of international law that, especially in the last 5 or 6 years, have become apparent, where we, as lawyers, are operating without sufficient assistance. And we really need the academy to step into the breach and provide us more guidance about how to handle, especially the behavior and conduct of non-state actors. International law and international human rights law in particular are really still state-centric frameworks, although it's absolutely clear at this point that everyone recognizes that states alone are not what's important. And I'll talk about that a little bit as I'm moving on. But I'll try to be brief in all of those, and I'm going to try to leave some room for questions, especially the inevitable question, which is, how do I get your job? So let me tell you what my job is. Can everyone hear me? This is very fancy. Let me start with my work at Human Rights Watch, and Amnesty International is actually very similar in this sense. We are a research and advocacy type organization. That means that we try to find out about human rights abuses as they're happening, not from the internet, but based on direct observation. We put these observations into a report and we put it out. And up to here, we are essentially journalists, albeit with a kind of a legal policy wonky point of view. But the reports that we put out are not particularly different from something you would find in Foreign Policy magazine or in a longer Time magazine piece, for instance. Not as well written, because they're mostly written by lawyers, but still Now, the second part of it is the advocacy part, which is we take those reports and then we identify who can affect the abuse that we've identified, and who can change the policies that we've identified. And actually, my last year at Human Rights Watch, I was Human Rights Watch's Washington advocate. I was based in Washington, and what I did is I was a fully normal lobbyist, except I didn't have a big wad of cash to hand out to people. I would go around, talk to Congress, talk to the National Security Council, the State Department, anyone who would listen about what we had found and how we could improve the situation. So I'll try to give you a little bit of that sense. I came out of a litigation background and then academia. My work in the academic world focused on the responsibility of non-state actors like multinational corporations and armed groups. And I got a job at Human Rights Watch basically by happenstance. And in 2001, our office is in the Empire State Building on a beautiful day, clear day like this. As I sat in my office trying to write a report on Turkey, I saw a plane hit the World Trade Center, which was quite alarming, as you may imagine. I didn't quite know what had happened, and as I stood there taking photos of what I thought was an accident, I saw a second plane hit the World Trade Center. And this, of course, raised the very real possibility that the third plane would hit the Empire State Building. So we rushed out of the building, and for me personally, for the people of New York, and I think for the rest of the world, things suddenly changed at that moment. For me, this was really a moment where as an Iranian American, although at the time I didn't have U.S. citizenship, I remember the first thing that I thought was, I really hope it wasn't an Iranian plot, because life could be very difficult for me. As it happened, we found out that it wasn't, and but nevertheless, the world shifted dramatically. I got my U.S. passport on October 28th, I believe, of 2001, and on October 31st, I was on a plane to Pakistan, to the border areas with Afghanistan. And then after that, I became a specialist on conflict areas. And so I worked mostly in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Nepal, and on other conflicts in places like southern Thailand, Kashmir, the Philippines, and Indonesia. But it's these two conflicts, Afghanistan and Iraq, which I think are still at the heart of the legal challenges that we face today, and the political challenges. Just driving through Pennsylvania yesterday, it seemed like that's all I could find on radio was country music and the Democrats debating one another. So I'll go into a little bit about the political aspects of our work. But let me tell you, like I said, what we did. This is April 2003. This was April 15th, I think. Basra had just fallen. Baghdad was about to fall. And so we followed behind British and American troops to see what was happening. Just to give you a quick idea, if you can see, we were based in Kuwait. I had spent the previous month in Iran on the border trying to see if there would be a refugee flow, but there wasn't. And so we just drove on this little highway to Basra, which is right here. And I spent about the next few months basically in this triangle here, the quiet Shia triangle, I should point out. The reason we were there so quickly was because Human Rights Watch and Amnesty had learned after the Balkan War that given the media environment that we couldn't afford to stand back and just be remote reporters. We had to be on the ground. We had to try to get information as soon as possible. But I'll tell you something. When we moved to Iraq, what we were really looking for was abuses that had been perpetrated by Saddam Hussein, because these human rights organizations had worked for decades, for 2 decades, on chronicling and documenting all the abuses that Saddam Hussein had perpetrated, and now was our chance to actually try to do some real on-the-ground work. and try to find information and document stuff that we had only done remotely in the past. Of course, we were going to see how the war had played out too, but I admit that initially our focus was not on the conduct of the combatants, but rather on this opportunity to find out what happened. And what we found, of course, was this, Saddam everywhere. I want to remind you, because there is an image of human rights activists as kind of, you know, liberal tree huggers that we all get around and sing Kumbaya. And I want to assure you that that is not the case, that the discussions that I have and the criticisms that we sometimes have, especially of the U.S. government, by no means indicate that we are soft on perpetrators, or for that matter, as I'll get into it, soft on terrorism. This is something that I work with all the time. This is something that Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International have done quite a bit of work and in terms of discussing what's happened. The creepiest thing about Iraq, as you may imagine, as you have heard, is that it was Saddam everywhere, really everywhere. I've worked in a lot of authoritarian governments. I haven't been in North Korea. I imagine that's worse. But really, portraits of Saddam, giant portraits of Saddam. Saddam the technocrat, Saddam the cool guy with the beret and glasses, Saddam the tribal guy. I mean, the mythology of Saddam was phenomenal. And it was a heartbreaking place to go into Iraq immediately after Saddam had left. And at that point, he hadn't even left. Really, he hadn't been found, because you realize how traumatic the experience had been for Iraqis. And one of the most traumatic, one of the issues that I always, sticks in my craw, was a university professor, a professor of computer sciences from Basra University, who told us, and this is completely true, completely documented, he had spent 3 years in prison because he had shown up at the faculty lounge one day and he told his colleagues, hey, I just had the weirdest dream last night. I dreamt that I went to Iran and I was at the university there and I spoke with Iranian professors there. And that became the basis of a treason charge against him. He had not joined the Ba'ath Party as quickly as he should, and he spent 3 years in prison. And this was the world that we found. And again, this is what I went to Iraq to try to document, what Saddam had done. What we found was something else. What we found was complete chaos. And again, remember that these organizations had come out of the conflicts in the Balkans, East Timor, even Chechnya. And so there is now what can be referred to as best practices, accepted practices in post-conflict situations. The Geneva Conventions are absolutely clear. The occupying power has to provide security and stability and basic needs for the occupied population. This has been basically part of international law for almost 100 years. But certainly after the Geneva Conventions and Geneva IV were ratified, it's been absolutely accepted. Imagine our surprise when, in a meeting with U.S. and British military officers in Kuwait, while we were waiting for the invasion, I raised my hand and I asked a simple question. Will the United States treat Iraq as an occupying power? This was a no-brainer. This was actually just the first part of a multi-part question, because we wanted to ask how the U.S. would allow humanitarian organizations to go in, how would it allow journalists, for instance, to operate. It brought the meeting to a halt. The U.S. officer, a lieutenant colonel, said, I have to check with Washington on that. Now, that was bad. Because what we found was this kind of looting. That's Basra University in the back. This is actually pretty far gone. This was just a daily thing. It was kind of like Wegmans without a checkout counter. People would just go in and just come out with chairs and chimneys. Well, it was, I'm making light of it, but it was quite traumatic. This was the other aspect. Now, this is, I think, the Education Ministry. And as you can see, this is not combat damage. This is looting. So what happened is looters went in out of anger or just as part of the looting. They set the whole building on fire, which meant that all of those records disappeared. And this happened in almost all of the government buildings in Iraq. And again, this is kind of occupation 101. If you take over a country, you have to keep it running, because if you break it, you buy it. And you now own the Iraqi population and their obligations. This is the Ministry of Oil in Iraq. In Baghdad, as you can see, it was completely protected, of course. So the problem is the Ministry of Oil in Iraq didn't really do anything for the Iraqi people. So I just broke it, I think.
It's all good.
Okay. Thank you. So this was the situation that we found ourselves in. And just to give you a sense of this is not the best picture, but it's all I had. You know, the light fixtures are gone. This is the Minister of Justice. The light fixtures are gone. The windows are gone. Window panes are gone. I mean, the looting was, it was unbelievable. And then, of course, when we went to British and American troops and said, okay, what are you guys going to do to stop the looting? Where are the military police? Who's training the police? What's happening? If you remember, what they did is they disbanded the police immediately. This is not the de-Baathification. This was just that they just told the police, don't show up. And so suddenly you have a city like Basra, newly released from Saddam's rule, and this is the situation that we found ourselves in. After a few weeks, we just realized that the Americans and the British were utterly unprepared for their basic legal obligations. Because the looting set aside, this is the other thing that we found. And Saddam, in all his mercy for his people, dotted Iraq with literally thousands of these containers. These are artillery shells and anti-tank shells. And then he opened them. So when you hear about IEDs in Iraq, about the weapons that they're using against our Humvees and everything, where they're coming from, be careful of the spin, because there are millions and millions of rounds of ammunition that were just there. Now, you would expect the military to be more concerned about this than just the looting. Again, we went to the British and we said, you should do something about this. This is dangerous for your troops, but being human rights guys, it's more dangerous for these guys, because kids love things that explode. And so one of the things that we discovered is that Basra General Hospital every day was having 5 or 6 kids, admitting 5 or 6 kids. What they would do is they would put this on top, they would take a rock, and they would smash it on this. Now, the good news is that that's not enough energy to set off the actual artillery round, but it will set off the little amount of ammunition that's basically the trigger, and it results in a very classic type of injury. Fingers are blown off, and it's damage from the chest up. And so we went to the British and the Americans and we said, here's the Geneva Convention, here is the U.S. Army Field Manual, here is what it says about what you have to do. And again, this is very basic legal talk. We are speaking with military legal officers. This is just like a corporate contract negotiation. We say, these are the obligations, these are the problems, what are you going to do about it? And amazingly, the answer was, we don't have the resources and we don't have the mandate. So we're not going to do anything about it. And what they did after a few weeks was this. The auxiliary police, it is not that they are fans of table tennis. That is their sign of authority. That's the stop sign that they used. And that is their nightstick. And the result, as you may imagine, was that the city was immediately taken over by armed groups, by militias. And the result is what you've heard over the last few weeks, where the Iraqi government had to go in with U.S. air support and reconquer Basra. And remember, this is the quiet part of Iraq. And we had a government that completely failed to uphold its legal obligations. Again, I want to be clear, this is not a political issue about should we have gone in or shouldn't we have gone in or any of that. This is just basic international law. And this is what we found in the quiet part of Iraq. This is what we found in the not quiet part of Iraq. This is in Fallujah. Fallujah, you may remember, is a Sunni town. It had to be taken twice by the Marines in some of the most brutal fighting that the Marines experienced in Iraq. This was the situation in May 2003 when Human Rights Watch found the gun market at Fallujah operating perfectly out in the open. There was, again, absolutely no security there. Absolutely no security there. So this is what we found. You know, people just selling guns off the back of trucks. And again, when Human Rights Watch went to the authorities and said, what are you going to do about it? They said, we don't have the manpower. Now, what they did do about it ultimately was that they went in with full military force to retake the city without giving them adequate warning. This resulted in a serious loss of life to civilians, which then really started this whole cycle of the Sunnis starting to attack American forces and American forces attacking them back. But, you know, I guess we at least were there at the beginning to see what had happened. But I want to go back to, again, to the other part of the work that we did. While we were doing this spot work on the law of occupation and on what was happening, we were really trying to find what Saddam had done. Because the one major advance of international human rights, the international human rights legal framework, has been the notion of criminal responsibility and the creation of the International Criminal Court and the experience of the tribunals in Rwanda and in Yugoslavia, former Yugoslavia. And so this was a phenomenal opportunity for the world to try to find out what Saddam had done, to try to identify exactly what had happened, as we did in the Balkans, for instance, and then hope that there would be some kind of justice system, some kind of accountability mechanism that would address what Saddam had done, because really what needed to happen was for the Iraqi people to come to grips with the horror that they had suffered through for the last 2 decades in particular, and to understand what they had seen. I hope everyone has finished eating. This is unfortunately what we found. This is in Hilla in central Iraq, and this is how bodies were being dug up. For fans of CSI, you know that this is not a good forensic device, a backhoe. We again called the U.S. military immediately, and we said, look, we all want to put Saddam on trial, but this is useless. You know, you should try to create a mechanism where you will guard off this area, and you can send in teams from the FBI, which is what you need and which is what had happened in the Balkans, to go and look at who's there and to try to find what happened. This is what happened. People were provided with plastic bags, and remains were put in plastic bags, and basically people were just allowed to walk through and to try to find some identifying mechanism. Obviously, the bodies had disintegrated. This is a mass grave probably from the early 90s. So people who were lucky found, you know, IDs, but there were very few of those. For the rest, it really was just walking through those graves. And all of Iraq is dotted with these remains. How do you decide if you're a mother and your son has disappeared for 15 years, 10 years at that point? How do you look at a bag like that and decide where your son is? The lucky ones, like I said, find IDs. But ultimately, that site is a complete wash. I mean, there's There is no justice for those people. We have no ability to identify most of them. We have no ability to try to establish exactly who did what to whom. But if you want to understand some of the issues that drive the sectarian violence in Iraq, it's this, because this is almost all Shias who were killed just outside a Sunni town. And, you know, the anger is still going on. This is a separate case. Sorry, I put it in my pocket. This is a different case. This is in Basra. These are remains, as you see, that have been processed enough that they were about to be put in graves. And this is a case that I worked on quite a bit. I'm proud of and frustrated about it. How many here know Chemical Ali? Chemical Ali Hassan al-Majid was Saddam's cousin, his chief enforcer. He gained that particularly odd name because in the early 90s, Saddam sent him to northern Iraq to pacify the Kurds, who at that point had been in open rebellion against Saddam, and Chemical Ali decided that he would use chemical weapons against the Kurds. And so he became known as Chemical Ali. It was a very brutal and successful campaign against the Kurds. Chemical weapons release frightened the shit out of people. He then moved down to Basra, where the Shias were putting up a fight. And fortunately, at least in Basra, he didn't use chemical weapons. These were just old-fashioned firing squads. After an attack on, after an uprising by Shias, he initiated this particular attack. Now, I don't know if you can see some of it. For instance, among the things that we found when we looked at these series of bodies were pieces of rope. Most of these people had their arms tied behind, their hands tied behind their backs, and they were probably shot in the back of the skull. So very classic kind of execution style. You know, but even there, you know, these guys are unidentified. And I have to tell you that the basis for identification was quite sad. You know, people would say, "Oh, I remember, you know, my son wore those pants when he was taken." But what was very, very interesting about this case, and again, the reason I'm proud of what happened was one of the documents that were found in Basra among all those burnt out ministries that I showed you was this. Which is a list of names. On the side, on the top, it says people who were killed as part of this operation in 1999. And it happens to be a list of names of young men. I mean, the birth dates, you know, in this middle column, 75, 75, 75, 73, 75, 77, 1970, 1977. These were young men. Remember, they were killed in 1999. So almost exactly your demographic from the same neighborhood. And we could correlate the bodies that were found in two of the mass graves with this list. And so we had a high degree of certainty that those people had been killed in this. And what's particularly interesting about this is that it has the handwriting of Chemical Ali and his sign-off. It says under the approval of the Commander-in-Chief of the Southern Sector, who was Chemical Ali. So then we went and interviewed former military officers and the families, and basically we put together what is essentially an indictment of Chemical Ali, and we put out that report and we gave it to the U.S. But remember now what was happening with the tribunal in Iraq, which was a tribunal where due process was simply incapable of being followed, and at the end we saw Saddam Hussein hang in the way that he did without really having to provide any answers for all of these other crimes. And so this case and the families remain completely unhappy, obviously, about what happened. Let me switch tacks a little bit about some of the other work that we do and talk a little bit about the advocacy that we do. Like I said, our work in Iraq and Afghanistan, in Chechnya and the Balkans focused on the impact of fighting on civilians, and of course the obligation of the combatants to protect civilians to the extent possible. And one of the issues that we've identified as very problematic is the use of cluster bombs. Cluster bombs are, it's a big bomb that's full of little bombs that then go out over a very large area. So if you want to kill thousands of troops massed in a front, it's a great way of killing those troops. It's not so good when it's used in urban areas. And remember, what Saddam's troops did under orders was to move immediately into urban areas so they could basically shield themselves and they could attract American fire. So Human Rights Watch did quite a bit of work on cluster bombs. You can see that's the delivery device that's been found here. This is the impact of it. What happens with cluster bombs that's particularly problematic is they have a dud rate. So even if the dud rate is low now, even if it's around 7 to 10%, in the best case scenario, that's what it is. That means 7 to 10% of thousands and thousands of bombs don't explode, and so they just sit around as landmines, essentially, as very sensitive landmines. And of course, really the people who are most at risk are children. And they're most at risk because that's what these unexploded ordnance looks like, bright yellow with a very nice parachute on top. So if you're a kid, what could be more fun than that when it drops from the sky? This is something that has been quite problematic. Now, let me tell you a little bit about how Human Rights Watch, for instance, worked on this campaign. We got all of that information. We did a huge mapping exercise. My colleagues who are military experts basically sat down and took a look at where these cluster bombs had been used and what the impact on civilians was. We took that to the U.S. military and we said, look guys, you're basically killing too many civilians for this. You're violating the law. And this was a very high-tech, wonky, military to military type of discussion. And to its credit, the U.S. Air Force agreed. And they said, we will no longer use airdrop munitions. Unfortunately, the U.S. Army didn't. The U.S. Army said we have to rely on munitions. So, that's unfortunately what happened. Now, while we engage those governments directly, we also are trying to follow on the success of the Landmine Treaty effort, and by trying to create an international treaty that bans cluster munitions. And that's something that's going on right now. And my colleagues are working with civil society from around the world to get different governments to sign this. Unfortunately, the U.S. opposes this treaty, but also some of our allies who are normally more kind of human rights friendly, including the Europeans, are fighting this because basically these are very useful weapons to have for killing people. And now that especially those European powers find themselves in Afghanistan, they're suddenly loath to give up the opportunity. But this is an example where the advocacy work went from the very specific lawyer to military lawyer type meeting to what is essentially a broad international campaign now. But I want to talk a little bit about Afghanistan because the situation there has been somewhat different from Iraq. It's a country that has suffered tremendously from absolute lawlessness, and it's a classic failed state. There is no state to look at. The Taliban became something of a state for a few years there, but of course the U.S. ousted them. And it's the place where I've spent most of my time at Human Rights Watch in Afghanistan. And I'll run through this. This is the problem in Afghanistan. These are the good guys. These are troops of a warlord who is allied with the United States. The U.S. pays him to fight the Taliban. Now, it may be that they're fighting the Taliban. The problem with these guys is that they're actually not very human rights friendly themselves. And among the things that we've seen in Afghanistan that's quite tragic is, for instance, that it is still almost impossible to find a woman not dressed like this in public in Afghanistan. You'll see them on the media, maybe in some government buildings, but to go on the street, they'll still put on that burqa. Of course, I don't really care what they're wearing, but the issue is that they are not able to work, they don't have access to health care, they don't have access to schools. So Afghanistan has some of the highest maternal mortality rates ever seen anywhere on the planet. It has the lowest rate of literacy among girls. And that's actually, once you look at girls up to secondary school, there's almost no girls in school at all. And so the generational impact is massive. It's not just that these people have suffered, but that the future teachers and nurses and educated women are no longer there. Let me run through these. These are men belonging to this particular warlord, Ismail Khan. Looks like Santa Claus, but is decidedly not of that. Well, I guess coals for the wicked. I mean, he was a pretty brutal guy, and he was a different type of campaign for Human Rights Watch. Ismail Khan ruled Western Afghanistan, where at the time there really wasn't any Taliban. And so we went to the U.S. with documentation of the abuses that his forces were perpetrating against the civilian population. And one of the most odious, one of the most difficult was the problems that women had. And Western Afghanistan, Herat in particular, had a very bizarre, tragic epidemic, which was young women who wanted to escape forced marriages, immolating themselves to escape. And so you had 30 or 40 reported cases every year of young women who had killed themselves by dousing themselves with kerosene and setting themselves on fire, which is, I mean, you have to be genuinely desperate to suffer from that. And it was partly because of the depredations of Ismail Khan's forces. This was this was one of the more political campaigns we ran, because when we came to the U.S. and we said, look, you got to get rid of this warlord, they said, he fights the Taliban for us, and we can't get rid of him. And there's this tremendous lack of trust in the Afghan people, basically. The notion is we can't trust them, they need warlords. We managed to prevail for a variety of political reasons. He was removed to Kabul, and fortunately, contrary to all dire expectations, nothing happened in Herat, really. And, well, that's the good news. But partly because of the actions of people like Ismail Khan and the warlords right now dominate Afghanistan's current cabinet, the Taliban have been able to launch a very successful public relations campaign and say, all the old warlords are back in power, and they're going to come and get you. And at least we, the Taliban, were not so bad, and they have come back. I'll talk about that a little bit. But I want to end with this photo. Of course, it's a beautiful shot that I didn't take, obviously, and an image that is by now, unfortunately, ubiquitous and familiar, an Afghan man being taken by American forces with a bag over his head and so on and so forth. And I want to end a little bit about the other kind of legal work that I did, which was to appear at the beginning of the military commissions. I was one of the members of the first team of international observers to go to Guantanamo and watch the military commissions that were set up start. And let me tell you, as a former litigator, as a human rights activist, as someone who's seen trials in other countries, few things could be as sad as watching the ridiculous spectacle of American-trained lawyers trying to come up with an entirely new system like the military commissions when all due process protections were off. And on that very, very first day, all proceedings came to a halt. Hold it, because the defense lawyer objected. And then they thought, how do I object? And the prosecution said, I don't know. How do you object? And who decides on an objection? And who gets to deal with an appeal of an objection? And on what grounds do you object? And so they just stopped it. So immediately, on that very basic notion. And of course, this debacle has continued until now. And let me move to the second part of what I wanted to talk about, which is a little bit more legal. And it's exactly this issue of what do we do now? It's no point to just complain about what has happened in Guantanamo at this point, I think from President Bush on down, everyone in the U.S. certainly agrees that Guantanamo has to be closed down. The question is, what do we do? What do we do with the inmates there? They've been held, in some cases, for 5 or 6 years. Under some tough conditions. There is very little evidence that is permissible, available anywhere. A lot of the information is hearsay. A lot of it is just plain outdated at this point. A lot of it was achieved under, certainly cruel and inhuman punishment like waterboarding and slapping and use of different methods that have now been ruled illegal by the U.S. So this is the situation we find ourselves in, where the Afghan government tells us we can't accept Afghan detainees from Guantanamo because as soon as you send them back to us, we have to let them go. We don't have a case against them. Under what charge are we going to hold them? And the U.S. says, well, we don't want to have them released. And that's the problem that we've seen, especially with Bagram Air Force Base, where the Afghan legal system has said that we can't handle these cases at all. But the other part of Guantanamo that no one talks about is that we do know that there are certainly some Taliban officials who are held in Guantanamo. And it's a tragedy. It's a genuine policy mistake that after 6 years, not a single one of these folks has been put on trial for what they did in Afghanistan. Not one. We have no idea. Nobody has told us what the Taliban's command structure was. Nobody has told us about abuses that were perpetrated by the Taliban. I mean, if you're the U.S. government, don't you want that? Don't you want to put on trial the people that had so abused the Afghan people and say, these are the people that we freed you from? Well, that hasn't happened yet. But it brings us to this legal issue that we have now of what is the international legal basis for putting a Taliban official on trial. At this point, it's absolutely accepted when politicians talk and policymakers talk and when human rights activists talk, even when lawyers talk, that non-state actors can be human rights violators. We talk about a corporation that's a human rights violator, or Al-Qaeda violating, or terrorists violating human rights. But of course, in the classes that we were taught, and things haven't changed that much, that's not really possible. I mean, it's still a very state-centric system, and we have to come up with a better understanding of how international law really operates. We have to ask, on what basis do we suggest that a terrorist organization has human rights obligations? Is it because the state has signed on? Is it because at this point we've decided that that's the case? Well, with non-state armed groups, international humanitarian law and the laws of war provide some coverage, but not human rights law. And we're really struggling with that. At this point, for instance, at Human Rights Watch, our last few missions on Afghanistan have focused on abuses perpetrated by the Taliban. So, for instance, attacks on schools. Now, that is a violation of the laws of war, but there are areas which one would not consider conflict areas, which probably the ICRC, which has the obligation to basically do this kind of analysis, would not decide this is a conflict area. So what is the law that applies to the Taliban? And I admit that as a lawyer, I shudder a little bit when I just go ahead and say they nevertheless have this obligation. But there is not enough work coming out of the academy that explains exactly why it is that we feel that a terrorist group has human rights obligations. We just haven't dealt with that. The same issue, of course, with multinational corporations. Before 9/11, when everybody was worried about globalization, there was a tremendous attempt to try to hold corporations accountable for human rights abuses. That didn't really go very far. We've had some successes in national courts under the Alien Torts Claims Act and some of the European courts, But that has also stopped. Although, for instance, in counterterrorism jurisprudence, we now see it accepted that a corporation that is engaged in support for terrorist activity can actually be brought up on charges, and that is moving up into the international arena, but we still don't know on what basis. On what legal basis do we view corporations as having human rights obligations? This is one of those areas where policy and reality have galloped so far ahead of the law that there's a serious disconnect about what's happened. And again, I hope this is something that some of you will be able to deal with. And of course, these two issues come together with private security firms, with the Blackwaters and the DynCorps. These groups are, if you are a private contractor working in Afghanistan, for instance, no law governs you. The Uniform Code of Military Justice doesn't cover you because unless you work on a military base for the DoD, you are not protected. You're not covered by American law. And it's only Afghan law that covers you. Of course, Afghan law, all foreigners living in Afghanistan have de jure, if not, I mean, de facto, absolutely, but de jure immunity from prosecution. There's just no possibility that the Afghan government is going to arrest somebody who works for DynCorps and put them on trial for an abuse. And so you have literally tens of thousands of private security contractors who are working around the world, and this number is going to grow, but who are completely outside of the protection of the coverage of the law. Now, the U.S. Congress is addressing this right now for Americans, but the problem is what will happen is that these corporations, of course, will very intelligently stop hiring Americans. They'll start hiring Chileans and Peruvians and South Africans and Nepalis. And then what are you going to do? Where are you going to find the Nepali DynCorps guard who just shot someone in Afghanistan? Under what law are you going to? I mean, this is the world that we live in. As a human rights researcher and advocate, for me, obviously it's quite exciting because we are at the place where the pedal hits the metal. We're there where we're gathering the information, where we're identifying these problems, and we try to come up with answers. But we are now at a place where we are looking actually at you and asking you to give us some answers, because the law is starting to run out of the problems that we're identifying. It's clear that the rights of individuals are being violated, but it is no longer clear who is going to be held accountable for those violations. And that's, I think, for me, the exciting next step in the development of human rights law and of what I'm going to be doing. So thank you very much.